This morning, we are going to be continuing the series we began a few weeks ago. We're looking at this teaching that Jesus gives. We find this teaching in the book of Matthew, chapters 5, 6, and 7. And we know this teaching as the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is this foundational teaching, and is something so important for us to understand and grasp, not just because of the words that Jesus is saying, but who he is speaking to and the implications that has for our lives. Because the word of Jesus had begun to spread all around the different villages and towns and people, and more people began to come and to follow Jesus and come before him. They were curious to see, are you who you really say you are? And others were coming desperate. They were hurting, they were in pain, they were suffering, they had diseases, hoping that Jesus could heal them and fix them and make them right again. And so as we get to the Sermon on the Mount, we see that crowds of people have surrounded Jesus, all kinds of people suffering from mental illness, physical illness, spiritually, emotionally. They come to Jesus and Jesus heals them. And so this large crowd gathers around him, and that's where Jesus kind of makes his way up a mountain, just get up a little bit higher, and begins to speak to the crowd. And he begins to share these words. And what Jesus begins to make clear is that he has come to bring his kingdom here on earth. That a part of why Jesus left heaven is to bring his kingdom, God's kingdom, here on earth. And what was so remarkable about all of that was that he is giving the invitation to this large crowd of people, all different backgrounds, all different things going on. And he's seeing this crowd and he's saying, you are invited into this kingdom. That Jesus says, I have a seat for you here. And not only that, but how my kingdom is going to grow, how it's going to move from village to village and city to city and town to town and nation to nation across the entire world is going to be through you. That I'm actually going to form a brand new community through all of you. And you are going to be the people that help bring my kingdom here on earth in greater and greater ways. Last week, we looked at this idea or this statement that Jesus makes and declares over the people. He says, you are the light of the world. This crowd of people, he goes, you are going to be the light of the world. And for the people, they would recognize that that was a statement that God had made about the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. That God saw that nation and says, I'm going to make you the light of the world, meaning that's meant to be your identity and your purpose in this world. You are going to be a light. And what God meant by that is the way in which you live is going to tell the whole rest of the world about who I am. That how you love one another, how you have compassion and mercy, how you bring righteousness and justice, how you live with holiness. But not just that, how you live as people that are full of joy and satisfaction. All of those things are going to tell the world who I am. Because they're going to see there's something different about the way you guys function. There's something different about how you all treat each other. And what is it about you? And when they come, they're going to come to understand, oh, it's because of who God is. The reason we love the way we love is because we have a God who loves us that way. The reason we're able to treat each other with compassion and mercy in this world is because we have a God that treats us with compassion and mercy. And so the natural overflow of our lives is we pour that back out into the world. That was what it meant for Israel to be a light to the world. That was their identity. That was their purpose. Jesus says, I am binding my identity to you. So you are going to represent me in the world. Who you are is going to tell everyone everything about me. And Israel rejected that. They didn't want to be the light of the world. They didn't want to follow the way God was calling them to go. They wanted to look actually like every other nation. They didn't want to be distinct and different. So they rejected God. They turned their backs on God. And they failed in God's heart for them to be a light to the world. And then Jesus comes on the stage. And Jesus begins talking about light. And he says, I am the light of the world. That I'm going to be the one that shows the rest of the world what it means that God is here and what it looks like for God to walk through this world. See, Jesus says, I am the image of the invisible God, the God of the universe. I am him. And so how I live, how I treat one another, how I walk amongst you and heal and care and love, this is a reflection of who God is. So Jesus says, I am the light of the world. I'm going to show the world who God is through me. And then he looks at this group of ordinary, unremarkable people that the rest of the world has really rejected and says, you all are now the light of the world. That is your purpose and that is your identity. And then Jesus spends the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, the rest of chapters 5, 6, and 7, showing them this is not what it looks like. This is how you live distinctly in this world. And so he gives them example after example of example. This is what this means. But before Jesus does that, he makes this very interesting statement. And so we're going to pick up this morning right here. We're going to be in the book of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 17. Verses will be on the screen. If you want to follow along in the Bible, you can. And in fact, if you don't have a Bible, we'd love to give you one. We have some on the coffee table, right over there. Help yourself. We'd love for you to have a Bible. But in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, after Jesus declares the people being the light of the world, and before he explains to them what it looks like to live distinctly, he makes this statement. He says, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." And we'll pause there. So a very interesting statement that Jesus makes, and I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking what he's trying to communicate, because that is going to unlock all the rest of the Sermon on the Mount for us. So he begins with this phrase, that I've not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill. I'm not abolishing, I'm fulfilling. And when Jesus says the law and the prophets, what he's referring to is the Old Testament. See, we hear the word law and we can have like a negative connotation with it. The law was the Torah. It was the first 5 books of the Bible. It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the Torah. That's the law. And the law wasn't a negative thing. The law was the revelation of God and who he is and his heart and his character. This is what God was trying to show Israel. This is who I am, so this is who you should be. That's what the law was. The law was a beautiful thing that showed the world this is God's heart. And by the prophets, Jesus means, and the rest of the Old Testament. So he's saying, I've not come to abolish anything about the Old Testament. And what abolish means is either you just set it aside, saying, never mind, we're going to ignore those parts, or abolish meant you are poorly interpreting it, meaning you're doing it intentionally. You're bending God's word, you're shifting it, you're kind of leaving a couple parts out, you're trying to make it work for you. So abolish, either you completely disregard it, or you misinterpret it, but purposefully are misinterpreting it. So Jesus is saying, that's not what I've come to do. I haven't come to abolish, but actually to fulfill, do the complete opposite. That I'm going to show you the fullness of the revelation of God and who he is. I'm going to show you the fullness of what it means to actually live as God is commanding us to live. I am the full representation of the law and the prophets before you. I'm not abolishing, I'm fulfilling. So what Jesus is doing is he's getting ahead of what he knew was going to be the pushback against him. That he's going to begin facing conflict, and he's going to be accused, and he's going to be accused of abolishing the law. He's saying, I'm not coming to do this, even though this is going to be the accusation against me. So the first implication of Jesus saying this is what he's going to be accused of. The second thing is what is apparent in this is that the way they are interpreting the law and the prophets is misaligned with God's will for it. That there's a disconnect somewhere here. So when Jesus says, I've come to show you the fullness of God's intent and heart in the law and the prophets and all his commands, it means something has gone wrong in how you all are interpreting it and living it out and practicing it. Does that make sense? So the first major point to recognize, not abolishing, fulfilling, there's a disconnect. But at the end of this section, he makes this really interesting statement. He says, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will not enter this kingdom of heaven that I'm bringing. which is a very strange statement because he's invited everyone in. But then he makes this phrase that your righteousness has to be better than the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. So let's talk about the Pharisees for a moment. If you've spent time in the Bible, if you've ever looked through the life of Jesus, you're going to recognize that one of the groups that he has the most conflict with were the Pharisees. That Jesus' harshest words were for these religious leaders. And when we see that, we can begin to almost think of the Pharisees as like the villains of the Bible, or like if this was like an old silent movie, these are the people that are twirling their mustaches, or the silly little Pharisees, and we can make them caricatures. But here's who the Pharisees were. They were religious men who devoted their lives to the strict adherence of all of God's commands. That's who they were. Religious men who just dedicated their entire life to the strict adherence of all of God's commands. And there are 613 commands of God in the Torah. So they're like, that's our life. What motivated them, what this came out of, was they had both lived and seen and experienced what happens when you turn your backs on God and when you don't follow his commands. See, they've seen what happens to a community of people, what happens to a group, what happens to a nation when we choose to turn our back on God's commands and go our own way. Because that's exactly what Israel did. They didn't want to follow God's commands. And God was telling them, this is the pathway, Israel. This is the pathway towards life and joy and satisfaction. The pathway you are walking down is a pathway that leads to destruction and pain and suffering. And Israel's like, cool, that's the direction we want to go. They didn't want to follow God's command. They didn't want to follow God's heart for their life. They wanted to go their own way. God warned them again and again and again. This is what happens when you don't follow my commands, because the life I'm trying to offer you is a life of fullness. This is what it looks like to be fully human in this world and have a life of flourishing. They ignored God. They turned their backs on God. And it led to their destruction. They were conquered again and again, and ultimately they were exiled out of this land that God had given them. God had promised them this land. It was called the Promised Land. This was supposed to be a place of abundance for them where they would live and be this beautiful nation and the light to the world. And because they turned their backs on God, they were conquered and they were exiled out of that. So the Pharisees see all that, and they're like, that's never going to happen again. That we're never going to turn our backs on God in that way. And so we're going to be people that strictly follow every single one of the commands and teach others to do the same and bring others along. So not bad. Where it began to go sideways is how they chose to do that and what began to motivate their lives. This is where the disconnect began to become with God. And so one of the ways they decided to accomplish, this is how we're never going to break one of these laws, is they began to use a method called fencing in. And here's a silly kind of example of fencing in looks like. This is how you fence in a command or a rule. Like if you were 16 years old and your parents hand you the keys and they're like, there's a brand new sports car for you outside and it goes really fast and it's awesome. This is your car. Here are the keys. This is for you to drive, but don't drive this car for a year. You're still learning how to drive. This car is really fast. We don't want you to get hurt. We don't want you to hurt anybody else. Don't drive the car for a year, but that's your car. And after a year, when you're 17, take that car and enjoy. So you're like, great, got the car, but the command is don't drive the car. So now we begin fencing in that command. Well, I'm going to mess up and drive that car. So you know what? I'm going to give my parents the keys, because if I see the keys, I'm going to want to drive the car. So parents, here are the keys. But you know what? I know where my parents hide things. They're not good at hiding things, so I know where those keys are. So you know what we're going to do, parents? We're going to dig a hole. The hole's going to be 6 feet deep. It's got to be really deep. We're going to dig a 6-foot hole. We're going to put the keys in that hole. We're going to cover that hole up. Great. Now the keys are gone. But you know what? Every time I see that car, I'm going to want to drive it. So let's cover that car. Okay, so now the new rule is we cover the car. No one can see the car, look at the car. You know what? It still looks like a car. Let's build a garage over that car. Okay, so now the car is in the garage. You know what? Let's lock the door of that garage. Okay, let's dig another hole and put the key in there, and on and on and on and on, right? This is what it looks like to fence in the law. The command was, don't drive the car. You might get hurt. Wait a year. But instead, we've created all these other rules and things that we have to do to make sure we don't do the one thing that was being asked of us. Does that make sense? So that's what they began to do with God's commands. They took the 613 commands and they added thousands of rules and regulations on top of that, inventing thing after thing. Their motivation was, don't mess up what God tells us to do. The way they went about it totally turned away from God's heart and intent. See, one of the main things that was in conflict with the Israelites and God. That led to a lot of this fencing was this idea of the Sabbath. We find the Sabbath in the 10 Commandments. The command for the Sabbath is remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. That's the command. We remember the Sabbath and we keep it holy. How do we remember the Sabbath? We remember that God created the Sabbath as a gift for us, that God models it himself, that in Genesis 1 and 2, it says for 6 days, God created everything, heaven, earth, everything. God creates in 6 days, but on the seventh day, God rests. Why did God rest? Was he tired? No. God rested to show us this is how we're designed to live. That we're meant to live in this beautiful, healthy rhythm of work and rest in our life. This is what it looks like. God is showing it to us, saying this is how you're intended to live. You're not meant to work 7 straight days or work nonstop or work yourselves to death. That's not how you're designed to be. That's not how you're going to operate best. Nor are we, sadly, meant to just live on vacation all the days of our life either. Like, no, there's a healthy rhythm in there, and there's a rhythm of work and rest that we're supposed to live and engage in. And so when we remember the Sabbath, we remember this gift that God has given us and tells us this is the way we're meant to live. This is a life of flourishing and joy when we live in this beautiful rhythm. And how do we keep it holy? Well, we acknowledge that, and we step into that. And for us today, that means when we take the time to rest, and whether we go for a walk or grab a cup of coffee with a friend, or we go surfing, or we go play golf, or whatever that means to you, we do so remembering, oh, this is a gift from God. That God gave us this earth and this world to enjoy and to step into. We're not meant to just survive in this world. We're meant to thrive. And a part of that is resting and enjoying it. So when we even walk out of here today and we look outside and see the sky, we're like, okay, God is good. And he's given this earth for us to enjoy it, right? Sabbath, beautiful, gift from God. Israel said, They didn't want to practice it. They didn't want to do it. They kept saying, nope, we're not going to ever do this. It was one of the reasons they were exiled out of their land. And so what do the religious leaders do? The Pharisees. The command is do not work on the Sabbath. So they built 39 different categories explaining what the word work meant. Can I carry something? Maybe. How far are you carrying it? How heavy is it? Can I walk this far? You can walk half a mile, but you can't walk 3/4 of a mile. Can I help somebody that's hurt? Are they dying? If they're dying, you can help them. Maybe. Are they your family member? Are they a friend? Are they a neighbor? Is it an animal? What if the animal is helping me work during the week? Maybe you can help it then. This is not made up. These were some of the rules and categories that they began to put in place for the idea of what does it mean to not work on the Sabbath. So if you grew up in this time and the religious teachers are teaching you this is what the Sabbath means, what does it look like to you? It's a bunch of rules to follow. It's a bunch of boxes to check. It's this external thing of don't mess this thing up. Is anywhere in there understanding what was God's heart and purpose in this? No, that's been completely robbed out of this. This has been carved out of it. Now the Sabbath is a ton of rules, a ton of regulations, and things that's become a hindrance and burden to you. The Sabbath isn't joy and freedom. The Sabbath is a burden that you don't mess up once a week, right? This is where Jesus is having conflict, saying you created all of these systems and structures that you've turned knowing and loving God into a bunch of rules that you're meant to follow. That you have made this all about external acts that you're doing. So when Jesus is saying your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees, he's not saying invent another 1,000 rules that you must now go and follow. No, he's saying we're not aligned on what righteousness looks like. That the religious teachers have taught you righteousness is a bunch of external things that you do to make yourself look good and make sure you don't mess up. And I'm telling you, I have a higher standard for righteousness. It's not simply these external things you're doing, but I'm interested in who you are in your heart. Because external things don't change your heart. I'm seeking to transform you. Why? Because I'm creating and forming a community of people that's going to change the world. It's not just about these external things that you're doing. It's about who you are. It's about your being. It's about your heart. It's about what motivates you. Then when we become a religion full of rules and boxes to check, we lose God's heart. The Sabbath was meant to be joy and freedom and a gift, and it turned into a burden. So this is what Jesus began to push up against. This is the resistance he's going to face. It's from the religious leaders because he's telling them, y'all are doing it wrong. And you've so missed this, and you're leading people down this direction. And what the issue for Jesus was with the Pharisees wasn't just that they were doing that, it was their self-righteousness. We are the ones doing it right, the rest of you are wrong. You all are sinners. What sinners meant to them, because they were all sinners, sinners meant you weren't like us, and you weren't following all these commands and all these rules that we've made up. So Jesus goes, it's your self-righteousness, that you have no space to even look that you might be going about this the wrong way. You've lost sight of people, and you've lost sight of God. So Jesus goes, this is what I've come to do. This is the fullness of the law and Torah meant. Not a bunch of rules to follow and external things, but understanding God's heart and transforming ourselves to the kind of people that live in this world carrying his love and grace and compassion. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, I don't know what to do. I can rewind and start over. I asked that question. I'm like, I don't know what to do if somebody does this to me. That was a lot. So with all of that, Jesus now begins to give examples of like, here are the differences between the righteousness of the Pharisees and the righteousness I'm calling you towards. There's a higher standard. There's a different way to look at this. He's going to give example after example. We're going to look at just two of them this morning. We're going to look at the idea of murder and the idea of adultery. Super, super fun way to end our Sunday morning so we can get back to bed. Murder and adultery. And I'll just say this as a caveat. Each of these ideas we could spend 2 or 3 Sundays on. The conversation Jesus is about to have on the idea of murder and anger is so layered and nuanced. The conversation he has about adultery is so layered and nuanced. He is pushing against cultural things that are happening. He was pushing against things of power, people that had power above versus people use power against people. He was getting into like sexual dynamics and how men treated women. There are layers of stuff going on in what Jesus is saying. We're going to look at just that top layer of it this morning, just this idea of what does this new level of righteousness look like and how does it impact us today. But just know that we could spend a lot more time, and we will as we continue moving forward in these ideas. So just as a caveat. Okay. So now Jesus begins giving examples of what righteousness looks like in his kingdom. He says that you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. So some language is lost in translation because you're like, really? The word you fool, that's enough to get us all in trouble? The word raka and you fool were meant to be derogatory statements. They were demeaning statements. They were really meant to be these deep, awful insults towards people. And what Jesus is saying is this is an escalation of the anger in your heart. You begin making disparaging comments. You begin making derogatory comments. It begins to lead towards this anger and hate in your heart. And then that begins to flow out of you in action and how you behave and into violence and into murder. So Jesus is saying you're being taught, as long as we are a bunch of people that don't murder each other, then we're doing great. Jesus is saying, nope, there's a different type of righteousness that I'm calling you to. It's not good enough that we're not murdering people. Great. But what's going on in your heart? Because if we're a bunch of people not murdering, but we are carrying hate out into the world around us, we have missed the mark. This is the difference of our righteousness. They're saying, check the box. I'm telling you what's going on with you. Is the consequence for anger and murder the same? No. If I'm angry at you or if I'm murdering you, those are two different things happening. Does it stem from the exact same place? Absolutely. We don't suddenly move towards these rage of violence without it first stewing in us first. So what Jesus is pressing on is check your heart. What is happening in your heart that's causing you to carry this anger, this disdain, this rage towards others? What's causing you to use this language and to speak of others in this way? What's going on in your heart? Because that's revealing all the rest of what's going on with you right now. And he continues on in verse 23. And throughout this, we're going to see Jesus use hyperbole. He's going to use exaggeration at times. And he's doing it to prove a point. And so we're going to see one of them right here. So he says, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, meaning if you come to church and you're trying to give your gift, and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come back and offer your gift. Jesus is not saying if you have any issues with anyone, don't come to church. We would never be at church. No one would be here at church. No, he is saying this is the place where we come broken and trying to figure it out. What he is saying, take seriously the issues you're having with others. Pay attention to those things. And in fact, he's actually pressing back up against this idea of external acts. Because people would act like crazy people in the world and they have all this chaos and all these issues with people. And then they think, if I just come to church and look at me, guys, I'm at church, I'm sitting in the front row, I'm all good. Jesus is saying, nope. Do not pat yourself on the back just because you showed up because you're trying to make yourself look good and excuse all these other things that's going on in your life. You don't get to check that box and be self-righteous just because you showed up today trying to be self-righteous. Jesus is saying if you have issues with others, you need to take those things seriously. Work those things out. Figure out what's going on with you. What's causing all this confrontation between you and others? I think one of the areas where I deeply struggle with this. And I've seen people that I deeply respect their walk of faith. I look at people, I'm like, man, the way you love and follow God, like I want to follow that. But I've seen that same struggle in them as well. It's when we believe we're on the right side of an issue. When I believe I'm on the right side of an issue, whether it's something going on in my group of friends or something going on politically or in the world or with our governments, our city, ... If I think I'm on the right side of an issue, I begin to believe my anger can be justified. I begin to believe that how I begin talking about people that believe the opposite are, right? I begin to use disparaging language. How can somebody believe that? Are they an idiot? Blah, blah. We begin to talk like this and think like this and begin to view others a certain way. We can very easily justify our anger saying, no, but I'm on the right side of the issue. And so therefore, it doesn't matter how I think about the other side or think about people that might disagree with me or think about people that may have a differing opinion. And what Jesus is saying to us is just because you might be on the right side of something, how you're going about that, how you're treating others does not make you right in the kingdom. The ends do not justify the means in my kingdom. It matters how we disagree with one another. It matters how we think about these things. That we view people and recognize you are a child of God, I'm a child of God. You mess up, I mess up. We may disagree on this issue, but there's a way we can think about that and talk about that and treat each other that honors us and honors God. And yet that is something I see time and time again. And so the question for us when we think about this idea of anger is where in your life have you normalized anger? Where in your life have you normalized feeling this way and carrying this disdain for others and those around you? Where in our life do we need to reconcile that and be like, man, what's going on with me? That this is how I'm seeing people. Because Jesus is saying this is what begins to escalate in our lives. And it flows out of us then. We're going to skip down to the next one. And this one I want to just talk about for a few minutes is this idea of adultery. It carries the exact same heart and mindset. Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. It's one of the 10 commandments. But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out, throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Is Jesus advocating for us to gouge our eyes out and cut? No, that's hyperbole. He's exaggerating. What he is saying is take this seriously. Take this seriously. And he goes, we're not all doing great just because we don't commit adultery. Great, we didn't check that box. Great, what's the rest of your life look like? What does your heart look like? What's going on with how you are pursuing people and what are you consuming and flowing back out of you? Take this idea very seriously. And so he talks about the command of adultery, but then he uses this phrase that those who look at a woman lustfully. And definitely keep in mind that he's very specifically talking to men here, right? There's a lot of work Jesus is doing amongst this group of people saying, guys, pay attention of how you have treated women in this culture and society. So it says, for men, the way you look at women lustfully. And that word for us has a certain meaning. What it meant for them ties into another commandment, this idea of coveting. What does it mean to covet? And the commandment for coveting is against don't covet your neighbor's wife, but it also talks about don't cover their home, don't covet their servants, don't cover their land or their animals. It was a much larger conversation about what does it mean to live dissatisfied with our lives and always be looking towards something else because maybe that's what's going to bring me joy and happiness in my life. So yes, it is about adultery. Yes, it's about a sexual ethic. Yes. But Jesus is saying the idea of looking lustfully is much more about this idea of coveting. What is it about us that's always looking at this other thing, saying maybe that's going to be the thing. Maybe if I just have that, if I just have what my neighbor has, if I just get to that. Because when we begin thinking that way, when we become fixated with this other thing, whatever it might be, a person or a thing, we begin to draw our attention that way. And it begins to motivate some of our decisions, then begins to motivate our behavior. We don't get to adultery out of nowhere. There are 100 steps between the thought and the action, right? And so Jesus is saying, examine all of those things. Pay attention to all of these areas. Where have you normalized the things that you're doing? Where are you starting to step out of what you should be doing and you're beginning to bend towards this place where you're going to find yourself? Somebody who has committed adultery, somebody that has broken what they should be doing and don't care about the consequences and are walking down this line. Does that make sense? Jesus talks about these two major ideas, this idea of anger. And what does it mean to carry hate and disdain and the language we use describing others? He's talking about the condition of our heart. Where are we that we're constantly living dissatisfied, looking for something else to fill that need? Because Jesus goes, guess what? We all know this. It never satisfies. So we're constantly going to be longing for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. I want to invite the worship team back up. And this morning for us, there is two things I want us to really kind of consider. The first, maybe for you, today is just this beautiful reminder that Jesus isn't inviting you into a new religion full of rules that you must follow and boxes you need to check. What Jesus is inviting you into is a relationship with him. To come to know him, come to see him, come to experience who he is, come to see Jesus, are you really good? Is this really who you are? Because Jesus says that relationship is going to be what transforms your heart. And the overflow of that is going to go out into the world, right? That if your heart's full of anger, that's what's going to flow out of you. But if your heart is full of love and compassion and mercy, that's what's going to flow back out of you into this world. This is how my kingdom comes to the earth, through you, through this community. So some of us, maybe this is a beautiful reminder. This is not a religion of rules or boxes to check. There's a different standard, and it begins with a relationship with him. And for others of us, I think it's to wrestle with that question, where have we normalized some of those things in our life? Where have we bent? Where are we being satisfied with so little and not looking towards God's best for us? And this morning, I want to give us a time to respond. There was a lot of information that came your way. You handled it very well. I appreciate that. But every single week, we want to give you space. And I love this phrase. It's space to do business with God. God knew you were going to be here today. He brought you to this place. Maybe you woke up this morning, you had no idea that you'd wander into this room and talk about adultery and murder, but here we are. But God knew. And so you're here for a purpose. And so spend time exploring that. Maybe for you, your response this morning is to sit and contemplate all of that you just heard. Great. Maybe for you, it's going to be to stand and worship. Maybe for you, it's going to be to kneel and worship. Great. And this morning, one of the ways you can respond is through this act of communion. And communion is this thing that helps us remember who Jesus is. It helps us realize that the reason we have this invitation to come and to know God and to be part of his kingdom, the reason we are free from a religion full of rules and regulations, but instead are invited to come to be with the living God, is because of who Jesus is and what he did. That he gave his life on the cross so we could live in freedom and in relationship with him. Communion is the opportunity for us to remember that. On that last night when Jesus was with his disciples, and he would leave this night and he would immediately be arrested, put on trial, and he would go to the cross and give his life. On that last night, those last moments with his disciples, he gathered them together and he began this act of communion because he wanted them to know when they lost faith and when they lost hope and when things seemed really scary, that this would be an opportunity for them to remember God is good and God has you. So Jesus takes the bread on that night and he breaks the bread and says, this is going to be my body broken for you. And you take the bread in remembrance of me, in remembrance of what happened to my body. And then he takes the cup and he says, this is the blood of the new covenant. This is the fulfillment of everything the Old Testament talked about. And you drink this in remembrance of me. So if you want, during our time of worship, if that's one of the ways you want to respond this morning, the bread is over there, the cup is over there. You can take it whenever you feel like it. We're not all going to do it together. You don't all have to take it. Zoe's going to bring the kids back out too, so if you want to take it with your kids, feel free to do that. This is your space and your time. Use it how you need to use it. Do business with the living God. We're going to worship, and I'll come up and close us in prayer in a moment.